Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Alessia Rogai, and I am the Knowledge Management and Learning Coordinator of the project Bridge the Gap 2. Bridge the Gap 2 is a project funded by the European Union and it's coordinated by FIAP, the International Ibero-American Foundation for Administration and Public Policies, in partnership with 3 European agencies for development cooperation, the Spanish, the Italian, and the Austrian, and 2 international NGOs, the European Disability Forum and the International Disability and Development Consortium. The initiative aims to contribute to the socio-economic inclusion, equality and non-discrimination of persons with disabilities through more inclusive and accountable institutions and policies. Today, it is the 7th session of a webinar-based training cycle organized by Bridge the Gap, which is exploring different cross-cutting issues taken into consideration by the project action. We started months ago with the session on the CRPD and its principle, to go through inclusive project cycle management, inclusive communication, arriving today to talk about inclusive education. The webinars are conducted in English, French, and Spanish in separate sessions, and you can find all the previous sessions, the recordings, the transcription, and the learning materials on our website, on the Facebook and Twitter pages, and on our YouTube channel. You can find all these links here in the chat box in a while. As I said, this session today is a special one on inclusive education, addressing and removing barriers to access to education for persons with disabilities. The Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability instructs that countries must take steps to guarantee that persons with disability access inclusive education systems at all levels. In addition, the 2016 General Comment number 4 of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability reinforced the content of the article by interpreting inclusive education as a fundamental human right of all learners and a means of realizing other human rights. At this session, we'll explore, in more recent times, the international human rights law and the internationally agreed development goals reflect a clear preference for inclusive education. The inclusion of persons with disability in education is crucial for a number of reasons. Countries cannot realize the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals, notably Goal 4, without guaranteeing access to education for children with disabilities. Inclusive education endorses inclusive and open-minded society with benefits for students with and without disabilities, families of students with disability, and the larger community. Education contributes to personal well-being and its gateway to full participation in the society. And finally, not forgetting that states are legally obliged to include persons with disability in education under international human rights law, in particular the Article 24 of the Convention. So it means that from a legal point of view, the right to inclusive education is a fundamental human right. Well, I don't want to take more time to our speaker today because, as I said some minutes ago, it's a special session. We have not one but 2 special experts on inclusive education as announced during the last session. Sorry. Today with us we have the 2 coordinators of the IDDC task group on inclusive education, Julia McGeown and Tesni. Julia has been Global Inclusive Education Technical Advisor for Humanity and Inclusion since 2013, where together with a colleague, she oversees inclusive education projects in 13 countries worldwide. She's a co-chair of the Inclusive Education Task Group in the International Disability and Development Consortium and an active member of the Global Campaign for Education UK and has contributed to a number of different publications. Previously, she worked as a specialist pediatric speech and languages therapist in 2001, mostly in schools, for example, in mainstream schools, unit and research bases in the UK and New Zealand, and also worked in Nigeria and Uganda as a teacher, trainer, and lecturer for 3 years with voluntary service overseas. After gaining an MSc International Child Health from University College London with a focus on disability and development, she developed an interest in inclusive education and focuses on forging stronger links between education and rehabilitation in the inclusive education sector. Siân Tesni is CBM Senior Advisor for Education. Born in Wales, UK, she's a qualified teacher of learners who are deaf or hard of hearing since 1991. She has been involved in development work in low middle income countries involving amongst others policy development, guidelines, advocacy, capacity development and service provision related to ear and hearing care, audiology, education of learners who are deaf, hard of hearing or deaf-blind, and inclusive education generally. Siân, as I said, is a co-coordinator of the International Disability and Development Consortium Inclusive Task Group on Inclusive Education and contributor to many publications. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to dedicate your time today to this webinar. So I give you the floor in a while. Just a couple of suggestions. You have this webinar is live captioned, so you can find the link to follow the live captioning here in the chat box, and also in the handouts of your panel you can find concept note of this session and the presentation of our speakers today. So thank you very much, Julia and Siân. I give you the floor, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia, for that kind introduction. And my name is Siân. I'm Siân Tesni, who's on the panel here today. I will start the presentation by looking at, oh, for some reason okay, Alicia, the slide isn't going forward for me.
Just try to click on the bottom to exactly do.
I am clicking on the bottom.
Yes, then restart the presentation and see.
Restart the presentation?
It's moving? It's moving
yeah,
now?
it's moving. Okay, perfect. Okay,
great.
Oh, there we are, technology. What do we say? Yeah, so I will start the presentation by looking more at the CRPD and the Sustainable Development Goals and how it puts us in the context of inclusive education. And then Julia will take over and provide a more practical overview of how practically in the field barriers can be overcome. But before we started today, we just wanted to maybe put the presentation in its context in terms of key statistics related to the education of children with disabilities. And according to UNICEF's World Report of 2013, 1 in 20 children under 14 years of age have a moderate or severe disability. And the Education Commission report in 2016 gave us a startling figure of over 32 million school-aged children with disabilities in low and middle-income countries are out of school. However, when investment is made and there are opportunities for children with disabilities to attend school, an estimated approximate 25% return on investment can be made, and this is according to a study by ILO in 2013 in Nepal and the Philippines. A very recent research by Nidhi Singhal and Ricardo Sabates in Pakistan indicates that there are increased numbers of children with moderate to severe disabilities attending school, and these are making progress in terms of numeracy and literacy. But that despite these improvements, learning is still slower for children identified as having a range of moderate to severe difficulties. And despite overall increases in enrollment and learning gains in school, children with moderate, severe, or severe difficulties are less likely to benefit equally from these positive changes. And they identified some of the issues that we are looking at today, not specifically related to the children themselves, or their disability, but rather the teacher training capacity, budgets for support for assistive devices, and so on. So when we look at the international instruments guiding us towards the right for education for persons with disabilities, we have a number we can draw on. One being the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which recognizes the right of everyone to education, and that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and the sense of its dignity. Further, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which highlights Article 28 in terms of the right of young people, regardless of race, gender, or disability, or their place of education, be they refugees or in detention, as having a right to education. And further, Article 29, which looks at developing the whole child and looks at developing respect to all citizens. Further, we have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and specifically in Article 10, the right of girls and women to access education as a right. And then we have the CRPD, which we will focus on today, specifically looking at Article 24, which clarifies, and Alicia has also mentioned in her introduction, that state parties are to ensure an inclusive education system to all levels and as part of lifelong learning. And this equates with Sustainable Development Goal 4 as well. Article 24 clarifies the rights of girls, boys, women and men with disabilities to education and identifies a number of areas for implementation. For example, non-discrimination on the basis of disability, that children cannot be excluded from the general education system. They should be entitled to free and compulsory primary education and then on to affordable secondary and higher education. Persons with disabilities should also be able to access general tertiary, vocational and other opportunities as part of lifelong learning. It looks in detail at accessibility, meaning that children with disabilities must be able to access quality and free primary education on an equal basis with others in their communities. Reasonable accommodations need to be in place in case they require appropriate adjustments to accommodate their needs so that they can access education on an equal basis with others. Individual support needs to be available to ensure that they maximize their opportunity to academic and social development. This could mean having sign language interpreters. It could be school curriculum or learning materials in alternative formats such as Braille, Easy Read, and so on, or personal assistance during school hours. And broadly, the development of skills for life and social development, looking at different forms of communication that are needed. These can include Braille, access to accessible computer software, augmentative and alternative modes of learning, communication, and mobility skills, peer support and mentoring, and bilingual environments to enable learning of sign language and the promotion of the linguistic identity of the deaf community. But we can't look at Article 24 unless we look at how it also relates to others. It relates to Article 3 in respect of non-discrimination, participation, equality of opportunity and accessibility, and gender equality. Article 6, rights of women and girls with disabilities. Article 8, raising awareness, combating stereotypes, prejudice and harmful practices. Article 11 on the protection of rights, including rights to education and humanitarian emergency. Article 25, the right to health. Article 31 on data and others, including those on accessibility and assistive devices. And as Alicia mentioned, then in 2016, the General Comment 4 to complement and give more detail to Article 24 was developed. And this in response to the CRPD's committee's review of 47 countries, where they found that students with disabilities were still being refused admission to mainstream education, or they were being placed in segregated schools as a matter of course, or in classes, and some of these segregated schools would be boarding schools far away from their homes. Particularly in rural areas, the quality and to inclusive education systems at all levels was a concern. Provision of accessibility and reasonable accommodations, particularly related to accessible transport and educational assistive technologies, were a concern. Inadequacies in teacher preparation in order to ensure that children could be included in schools. And budget allocations were either insufficient or non-existent. And this was also found in the IDDC Costing Equity research and report that we published a couple of years ago, which led to the call to action for disability inclusive education financing. So general comment 4 helped to improve understanding of what inclusive education means. It helps guide governments towards an in-depth transformation of education systems in legislation, policy, and the mechanisms for financing, administration, design, delivery, and monitoring of education. It defines accessibility. It focuses on the importance of protection, regardless of where education may take place, safeguarding being an important issue. It also highlighted the need of education in humanitarian contexts and information about disaster risk reduction in different contexts. In short, the general comment focused on inclusion involving a process of systemic reform, with a vision serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and environment that best corresponds to their requirements and preferences. Placing students with disabilities within mainstream classes without accompanying structural changes to, for example, organization, curriculum, and teaching and learning strategies does not constitute inclusion. It guides us very well into, if we don't remember anything else about general comment 4, the 4 A's and Q's. The 4 A's being availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability, leading to us providing quality inclusive education. Availability meaning that programs should be available in good quality and quantity within the communities where learners with disabilities are living, and that all levels should be made available. Inclusion within and having school structures available for water and sanitation services, management structures, and including recruitment and continuous training for teachers. Accessibility, it gave a very thorough overview of what accessibility would mean for learners with disabilities, and indeed for all learners. Environments should be free, safe, and accessible, looking at not just the physical accessibility to schools, but looking at accessibility in the recreational and refractory facilities and in classrooms, ensuring that communication and language is available to reflect the need of the children in the classrooms, different forms of communication, learning materials in different formats, accessible information technology, assessments being flexible, support as required, and transport. After all, we might have an accessible school, but what good is that if we can't get to that school? Commitment in terms of reasonable accommodation and assistive devices. Acceptability, curriculum and teaching reflecting the local culturally appropriate context and in good quality. Adaptability, meaning that education is flexible and that it reflects the universal design for learning approach, which consists of a set of principles providing teachers and other staff with a structure to create curricula which is adaptable, learning environments which are adaptable, instructions to meet the diverse needs of all learners. And must be in place an individual progress towards providing alternative routes for learning to be recognized. This leading to quality and therefore equity. So if we move on to the Sustainable Development Goals, we know that in essence, from the paragraph 23 of the 2030 Agenda Preamble, that whichever Sustainable Development Goal we look at will imply inclusion of persons with disabilities. The inclusive phrasing of many goals and targets also make them implicitly applicable for persons with disabilities, such as those referencing for all or all women and men or vulnerable groups. There are also specific references, as we see in Sustainable Development 4.5, where disability is mentioned in relation to gender equality and inclusion. But even without any such references, all goals and targets will be applicable to persons with disabilities by simple virtue of the universality which applies to all and the overarching principle of leave no one behind. I'm not going to discuss on my next slide very much, because even for those of you who can see very well, it's a very busy slide. But I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that this resource, which highlights the connection between the CRPD and the SDGs and the links that they make, is available following this website in a bigger format, in a poster format, and also in an accessible format. So how do the UN CRPDs and the SDGs relate? Well, that we could say that the CRPD should serve as a guiding framework to the SDGs. The CRPD articles are cross-cutting in nature and must always be applied for implementing all goals. Therefore, Article 24 and General Comment 4 will complement and serve as a guiding framework to realizing quality and inclusive education, such as Sustainable Development Goal 4. Looking specifically at Sustainable Development Goal 4, it's implicit in the goal that it is to provide equity and quality education for all people as part of lifelong learning. It focuses on primary and secondary education. It also highlights the important need of early childhood care and education. It looks across technical, vocational training, including university, skills for work, inequality, literacy and numeracy, sustainable development and global citizenship, education facilities and learning environments, how we make those inclusive, the provision of scholarships to support education, and ensures the focus on teacher and teacher preparation and ongoing training. But is it enough to look at inclusive education and at school in its own context? Does education not begin before that? And I would argue that it begins from birth. So we can't consider inclusive education or sustainable development goal in its own right and on its own. What happens about the specialized schools that have been functioning for decades? What will happen to them in terms of this inclusive education approach? Well, many are already transforming themselves into becoming either inclusive education schools within themselves, or certainly as inclusive education support through providing resources to support the inclusive education within their area. And in so doing, they sometimes promote community awareness, or they assist in carrying out research and advocacy to their local district government and so on, and support with any specialized facilities. But it wouldn't be enough, as I said, to look at SDG 4 on its own. We need, indeed, education will look right across all the SDGs, but we also need to link with inclusive health services, as this forms a vital part of early identification and provides for preventative or healthcare needs and ensure that early intervention begins as soon as possible, reducing the impact of disability and increasing the opportunity for successful inclusion in school. In order to do this, we need to reach out for education for expectant mothers, education in terms of disability awareness for health workers, and so on. And where would any of us be without a focus on inclusive livelihood? I often speak with parents, and they will always say that what they want after education is that their child grows up to be independent in terms of work and in terms of their livelihood and living. Livelihood gives us a sense of self-worth, and importantly, it can give a step out of the poverty trap. And as part of my end of my session for now, until we come to questions, I just want to draw your attention to the IDDC Quality Inclusive Education poster emphasizing how the SDGs need to reflect an element of education in each one of them. There is a further poster which looks specifically at SDG 4, and I would encourage you to go to the IDDC website to look for that. In the meantime, I will hand over to Julia, and you may need to be a little patient with us as we try to change screens, as we are not in the same office. Thank you very much for listening so far. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Siân. Really interesting presentation. So now, as Siân said, we are going to change the speaker, and Siân, you can turn off your camera just clicking on the.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So now, just a second.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the button.
Now you should have the button, right?
Okay.
Great, I can see your screen.
Can everybody see? Okay, from current slide. Yes. Okay, everybody, I hope that was a smooth transition. So as Siân mentioned just then, I'll just show on my webcam here, if you can see me. This is the poster that Siân was referring to. That is quite helpful to talk about the links between inclusive education and other SDG goals. So I would welcome everybody to look at that. Just need to be able to see that, make that a bit smaller. And there we go. I've turned myself off just whilst I make the screen a bit smaller. Okay, so moving on to the next slide then.
Sorry, Julia, we can see your screen. Maybe you try to okay. Yeah, push again on the bottom of the screen to see.
Okay. Give control of the. Ooh. I'm not sure how to do that, Alicia. It's not clear on here. Could you redo the presentation?
No. Yeah, I can do that. Just try to push again on. Okay, great. I can see your screen again.
You can see the screen. Okay, I think we'll leave it on that rather than my my picture. So if I move it to the next, sorry, if I'm just trying to move it to the next next one. Oh, okay, I'll do it on that. Great. We're now moving on to the topic of the barriers. Siân mentioned quite a lot about the overall international conventions and instruments that are used to ensure that all children can go to school. However, what we're trying to do now is to draw that together to the reality of what happens in the field. And I thought a good way of doing this was to talk about barriers in 3 different groups. As you can see here, we've divided it into 3 different barriers, not just the barriers that you may initially think of, which might be the physical barriers. Often we think about, for example, ramps or other types of physical barriers that prevent access from children going to school who have disabilities. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. We have political system-wide barriers, we have environmental and school level barriers, and we have attitudinal and community level barriers. Okay, so if I start with the political and system-wide barriers, which institutional barriers, this would be, firstly, we can talk about the lack of poor quality legislation, policies and plans. As you can see from the slide, I have an example where there is an inclusive education policy, and this one is from Palestine, and there's many others in place. However, the recent GPE stocktake, which is the Global Partnership for Education stocktake that was done last year in 2018, which looked across 51 countries to see which countries had actually got inclusive education policies. Sadly, only 9 out of 51 countries had inclusive education policies, and that was just out of the 51 that they were looking at. So you can see that it's across the board not that common to have inclusive education policies. And even when they are in place, quite often there might be poor monitoring and follow-up. So there might be a disconnect between the policy and actual targeted budget and an action plan in terms of implementation. So in addition to the aspect of not having enough policies and not having enough action plans, there's also the difficulty that there might be inadequate resources and inadequate capacity, really, to implement the policies on the ground. That might be because of a lack of knowledge and awareness amongst the key decision makers on the topic, and it's obviously maybe not a priority area or key area for those in charge. And the fourth point here on the slide mentions that inclusive education is rarely a compulsory part of pre-service teacher training in teacher training colleges or universities. And this means that we are sort of stopping that development of the system of inclusive education holistically, because people will come out of teacher training college, they won't have any awareness about inclusive education methodology, and then we lose that opportunity to train teachers whilst they're training, rather than having to do it later on in ad hoc teacher trainings in different schools. So really that really is a huge barrier to realising inclusive education on the ground. If I move to the next type of barrier, so the sort of next level down, so to speak, we can see that this is the school level and environmental barriers. Perhaps you might call this the classic barriers, since it's the ones that people will often mention the most. And when I go around to different projects where we have inclusive education, we often hear people thinking that is what we're going to do if we're going to tackle inclusive education. We're going to maybe build a ramp, or we're maybe going to make toilets accessible. And as you can see from the picture, the top picture, which shows an inaccessible toilet, this is a crucial thing. Obviously, it's very important to make sure that school premises and classrooms are accessible, because it's a very common barrier for children with physical and sensory disabilities. For example, children who may need tactile markings, or they may need more colour contrast between the walls and the floor, for example, and other ways of making the environment more appropriate for children with visual impairments. These are very common barriers, because oftentimes these are not in place. And as Siân previously mentioned, it's not just about the school premises itself. The roads to and from school and the paths are often inaccessible. They could be too far, they could be unsafe, as well as not being very accessible. And that is another barrier that's very common in many of the countries across the world, really. Then the third point is on the other side, perhaps, of the discussion. As well as accessibility that's physical, there's also the accessibility in terms of curriculum and the actual teaching and learning that goes on right inside the classroom. And this is sort of going to the core of what the general comment 4 is talking about, that Siân mentioned. This general comment was really trying to drive the change in terms of how teachers can be teaching in an inclusive setting to enable all learners to be able to learn according to their own needs. Teachers do not have enough support, guidance or training to be able to adapt the curriculum, and they lack adapted materials, and this is a very common barrier. Typically, they may use rote learning or reliance on copying from the blackboard, and the type of teaching that goes on is quite often more passive learning, where that is very much teacher-led, and the teacher will either write on the board or talk, and then the children have to write down what they're saying, rather than it being a more active form of learning, which can be more adapted to different children's needs, depending on how they best learn. And throughout all this, the changes that would be required in inclusive education are actually very much more helpful for all children. So we're not just saying that these changes in methodology are only appropriate for children with disabilities. We're talking about benefits for all the children, and that's a very important point. The third group of barriers, so to speak, is the attitudinal and community level barriers. And so far, we haven't really mentioned this so much. It's less mentioned in maybe the international conventions and instruments, but it's very important in the reality, because you may, make a school accessible, and you may change the way materials that are available in the school, but if the parents do not want to bring their children to school, then that's not going to make the difference. So here are some aspects that might commonly be seen to be barriers. So the first one is that parents can feel shame and stigma if they have a child with a disability, so they may keep them at home. Other typical barriers could be that they have protection concerns about sending children to school, particularly if they have a disability. They may feel more overprotective and may feel they're more vulnerable to abuse or to violence or bullying, other issues. There's another concern is that the community pressure may be such that families of children with disabilities may feel discouraged to allow their children to mix with others. I've heard stories of children being described as contagious, for example, or having some form of disability that they shouldn't be around other children because they might be scaring the other children, for example. These might be the common concerns that might end up being the key barrier preventing those children from actually accessing school. And then finally, we can't forget the attitude of the school staff themselves. So even if the policies are in place to change the school and to enable inclusive education to be enabled throughout the school, it's no use at all if the school staff themselves still have negative attitudes. They maybe don't want to teach children with disabilities. They maybe don't have particularly positive images of those children, or feel that they can't learn. So these kinds of barriers are some of those that you'll come across in a whole range of different places. And I just want to point it out, the picture here is the pictures aren't really showing barriers, they're actually showing a way of tackling those barriers. It's showing a march past, it was called a march past, it was taking place in Sierra Leone, where there was a community-based march with singing and dancing and banners being held, and people were talking about the rights for all children to go to school, including children with disabilities. And they were they were helped by having adults with disabilities come along to the march to be able to describe positive experiences of going to school and how it's helped them in their future life. So what I wanted to do is to finish on a case study. I'm just wondering, I've realized I think that the webcam isn't working, so let's see if we can share the webcam for the last bit. Oh, but then I've lost the screen. Sorry, you can't see me, it's fine. So the last case,
we can see both.
You can see both. Oh, excellent. You can see me. Perfect.
Okay. Now just your screen with the presentation.
Because I can't see both. Never mind. I'll carry on. You can see me later. for fear of time. So the last point was about the Nepal case study. It's just a country sort of chosen because we happen to have a few projects there. No particular reason other than we wanted to share some barriers but also some solutions. because that was another topic of this webinar. So I wanted to go back through those 3 groups that I've mentioned, those groups of barriers, and just pick 1 or 2. These are not an exhaustive list by any means, just to highlight that for every situation, you will generally find these types of barriers. So examples of barriers for institutional or, political level barriers would be maybe there's a lack of awareness about the issues amongst some of the mainstream education stakeholders, then the insufficient teacher training, and also that the IE policy is not yet implemented. Then at school and environment level, we have issues of inaccessible school buildings and roads to school. And you can see from the pictures on the right, these are taken from the far west region where it's very hilly and mountainous, very few roads, and the roads that exist are not really accessible. So it makes it very difficult for somebody to move to school if they are using a wheelchair, for example. There's other school and environmental barriers too, such as the lack of mobility and assistive devices and other types of materials. And one other point that's specific to Nepal is that resource classes, which is a system that's been prevalent there for quite a while, which is more of a system of integration where the children are in separate classes if they have different disability types, and they are in the same school as other children, but they are taught separately. And in the past, they've been very much segregated, although the trend now is to become more inclusive. So that is a barrier in terms of the segregation aspect. And then at attitudinal level, particularly when we did a study on this a couple of years ago, we found that parental attitudes were quite strong in terms of overprotection, and that they didn't, there was a fear of sending children to school because of concerns of protection issues. And also teachers really believed that they could not teach children with disabilities in mainstream schools, perhaps because of the tendency to have segregated settings in the past. So those are some of the barriers. And then if we move now to the solutions, we have a number of different solutions. And many of these are in link with some of the strategies given within the UNCRPD that we mentioned earlier, and the general comment 4. So, but the specific case of Nepal, we can see that they are trying to improve collaboration between the different ministries involved. And something that Siân mentioned earlier in terms of the SDGs, trying to focus on different aspects, not just education, also health, also livelihoods. In the same way, ministries need to talk to each other. So Ministry of Health, Ministry of Women, Children and Social Welfare, they often have their own separate budgets that might be applicable to supporting children with disabilities in attending school, and that there needs to be collaboration amongst these groups. Similarly, there needs to be collective support from civil society to enable the ministries to be able to translate policies into practice. Examples here at the moment, I was there recently and we were discussing developing their master plan on inclusive education, implementation of the recent policy, these types of issues, training, human resources, scaling up IE training. So there's a real feeling of if everybody works together and brings together all the different parts that have been created by different NGOs and different organizations, this can really help to move forwards with the systematic change that we need to enable inclusive education to really take off. So those are some sort of high-level solutions, so to speak. There's also a need to support both the Ministry of Education, Science and Technology and the new Centre for Education and Human Resource Development to focus on inclusion. This is a point about different branches of the same ministry talking to each other and ensuring inclusion is embedded throughout. Separate issues are also the need to scale up screening activities in schools with clear follow-up and referral systems. Again, this is a bit linked to Siân's point about inclusive health and the need to collaborate. And also the need to provide disability identity cards which enable families to access additional financial support. I'm going a bit faster through this because I want to get to the practical poster at the end. So the additional solutions in terms of Nepal are really at the level of what's being taught at the school. So this first point here, I think, is a good description of what the General Comment 4 is saying. Nepal wants a holistic, inclusive education system where schools are renovated to be more accessible, trained teachers are able to develop inclusive classrooms and really bring in that inclusive teaching methodology, and also additional support staff are brought in. They may be volunteers, they may be additional staff to support with sign language, as Siân was mentioning, those type of additional HR, and that's prevalent in their policy. And then finally, we can't forget about community awareness raising and mobilization through the strong DPO movement. And there is a very strong DPO movement in Nepal. The National Federation for the Disabled is the big umbrella organization, and they themselves have a campaign about inclusive education at the moment. So that also helps galvanize this and bring the issue to the fore. And the final point is about the curriculum for ECD classes being more inclusive. ECD means early childhood development, and they have specific classes in Nepal for those younger children, but initially they weren't particularly inclusive, and now there's a drive to make those inclusive too. So those are some specific solutions from the context of Nepal. And my final slide is one to show a practical solution. I realize you won't be able to read the blue boxes. Really, this slide is just to show in a visual way what we actually mean by an inclusive classroom. So I'll just pick out a few of the key points. But you can also access this. We'll put this on the resource list so you can print out a PDF if you would like. There's also a French version of this as well. But I wanted to just highlight a couple of points. There are some accessibility features in the ideal inclusive classroom. You can see a ramp and some larger windows to bring in light to enable people who may have some visual impairments to be helped by a lighter classroom. But most of the features are to do with inclusive education and inclusive learning environment, where you can see group learning taking place, concrete teaching and learning materials. Then you can see buddy systems with children supporting each other. You can see the lower blackboard so that somebody who is using a wheelchair is able to reach the blackboard. There's also some visual supports around. You can see a visual timetable and other visual supports on the desks. There's some assistive devices, and somebody's using a communication board with a head pointer. Somebody else is using Braille, and there's a sign language interpreter supporting a young boy using sign language in the main classroom. And the other interesting feature is the resource room. The resource room is the small room on the left, which you can see. And this may not be right next door to the classroom, but it is on this poster. But really, this kind of place is ideal for small group teaching, maybe for catch-up classes, or more relaxing environment if children need sort of time out to be able to relax and just get away from the main classroom for a short while. There's also a space to create low-cost teaching and learning materials. You can see parents also being involved in that, making beads and counters and different materials that could be used in the classroom. So there's the idea of bringing the community also in, getting them involved in inclusive education. And I think that is the end of that section. So I'll ask for any questions. That's both to myself or Siân. I'll hand over to Alicia and try and work out how to share my webcam.
So, well, thank you very much, Julia and Siân, for this really interesting presentation. So now we can start with some question. I'm pretty sure that the audience will have some question for you. So don't be shy. I invite you to text your question in the chat box or directly raise virtually your hand and making your question directly to Julia and Siân.
As we're waiting for a question, may I make one other point?
Good.
I feel there was something that we both kind of missed in terms of our presentation, and that was the emphasis of encouraging persons with disabilities to become teachers, but also seeing and working with persons with disabilities and their families in terms of ensuring inclusion. Because I think just that extra point at the end.
Okay, yeah, that's true. Yes, rather than just the DPO movement, but you're right, in terms of teaching, yeah, as teachers, yeah, that's a good point.
So, well, if waiting just some question, honestly, from the audience, honestly, I would like to make a reflection, and maybe I have some question. We also work as Bridge the Gap in Ecuador on inclusive education. So for us, it's really important, and the topic that you put in place today, the arguments are really interesting for everybody and for Bridge the Gap in the case of Ecuador. So, well, the right to an inclusive education for persons with disability, we said that this is fundamental human rights. As you, Siân, mentioned at the beginning, several international instruments express indeed the link between the right to education and the needs of persons with disability. We have the convention and the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. They offer, I think, an exceptional opportunity to build more inclusive and fair society. The convention, above all, I think it's a unique tool at the moment that really calls explicitly for inclusive and quality education. To the other side, Julia talked about barriers. So we are aware about barriers, not always, honestly, but barriers between the international tools to arrive to put in place policies and plans on the ground. So yes, I think that at the end, my question is, so how practically, of course, we can, it's complicated, but how we can really reduce this gap between the international tools that we have to arrive to build really policies and plans on the ground. I mean, there are like common strategies or especially practical tools and good practices which actors should be involved in the process, or if you have some example of successful processes put in place in some country that have brought to inclusive education. Sorry if I take time, but I'm really interested on that.
Do you want to go first, Julia, or shall I?
I'll say something short and then I'll pass to you because I can't think of an example of a particular post just off the top of my head. But what I was going to say is that the general comment 4 that Siân mentioned, I think that's been a bit of a turning point in terms of a practical tool. I agree that often the sort of broader frameworks can sometimes be a little bit, you know, if we're using a sort of visual, you know, up here and actually not getting down to what needs to change on the ground. And they may be a bit general and too legalistic, but the actual general comment 4 is really quite helpful in terms of practical suggestions. For example, I know that I've used that on occasions of trying to convince ministries in different countries to do inclusive education rather than special needs education, so separate special schools, by showing them the examples, how it's set out on general comment 4. It will talk about what is the inclusive approach, you know, what needs to go, what is an inclusive individual education plan. It goes into detail about some of the supports that need to happen in order to realise the UNCRPD. Article 24, which it previously didn't. And I think if you go to a meeting, you know, to try and convince people in ministries about how to actually develop their policies, if you go hand in hand with the comment 4, it's a more useful tool to help then translate that into their action plans, because it does come up with some tangible suggestions. So I found that a particularly useful one. I can think of a few different countries actually where, you know, that's at least helped to go into the IE policy as it's being developed. One example was Liberia. We were using that. I think we were using it recently in, I think even during Nepal, actually, when they were developing the IE policy, you know, we used some language from that to try and convince people that was what they needed to do because they'd signed the UNCRPD article. So yeah, that would be my first comment. Over to Siân.
I think to put it on a more practical level, because I agree with Julia, General Comment 4 is a very good guideline that we have now. But I can also quote some experiences in countries, before General Comment 4 was written. For example, one in Nicaragua, very close to Ecuador there, the focus was on very much working from the community and developing community engagement as a cross-departmental focus. So working with communities to raise awareness about inclusive education and the right of children to attend their community school, working on developing the early childhood development education, which was endorsed by the Ministry of Education and has now become a countrywide program. And I believe and I understand that there is also in teacher education, I'm not sure if it's right across Nicaragua, but certainly I'm aware of one program in Nicaragua where there are blind people running the inclusive education teacher training, not just about how to include people who are blind, but rather the inclusive education generally. So I think there are some quite exciting examples. The other example I can think of is in Papua New Guinea, where again on a community level, but focusing very much on the teacher education level, where the program began with a demonstration of inclusion at early years level, with 7 deaf children and 13 children who with some other disabilities or non-disabled children as well. It was 21 in a class, to show how through using sign language as well as oral communication, children without hearing impairments were able to communicate and learn a very sufficient level of signing even before going on to primary school. But this was then developed as a demonstration for the teacher training institution. This, I mean, I won't go into all the detail, I think it's quite well documented, but this then formed part of the policy on education for Papua New Guinea, and part of that policy was to endorse that inclusive education should be a part of each and every pre-service teacher education. It's not to say that there are no issues, and certainly that program has now developed, I think, around 20 resource centers, which are run under the auspices of the Ministry of Education. So it started outside as a demonstration, but has become part of. So the NGO, if you like, and the government are working hand in hand in order to create a sort of nationwide inclusive education approach. So I think there are some exciting countrywide examples, and I'm sure other people listening today will have some to share of their own. I hope that helps to answer your query, Alicia.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer, you both. We have now several comments and questions. I would like to read a comment made by Ruth Naluguya. Sorry if I don't pronounce well your name. But Ruth, first of all, thanks for Julia and Sean for the fantastic presentation. And Ruth says, I like the well thought about solutions. However, I feel we miss a very important component or stakeholder in this. As you talk about a holistic education system, parents need to be kept in the cycle. We realize that most of them are not aware of their roles in the education of their children with disabilities. Parents need to be trained about their role and how to monitor and set education goals for their children, and this needs to be done closely with the teachers. In Uganda, we have realized the great impact involving parents alongside other stakeholders. I don't know if you both want to make some comments on the Ruth reflection.
If I go
Can
first,
I?
then thank you, Ruth. I think that's absolutely, and we certainly kind of missed the opportunity there. And thank you for the reminder. In fact, the program I was illustrating from Nicaragua, that was one of the key learnings, to work with parents in an accessible format. So the individual plans were developed in a very visual way, so parents could see and illustrated really well what they can do. And in fact, a number of those parents involved in the program are now advocates and are now involved in helping other parents to support their children. So I think this approach is absolutely correct. Thank you.
I just add something to that. I completely agree. Thank you for your comments. And in fact, it's probably more of a logistical, but it's a bad logistical error that I kind of felt I'd already written a few solutions, but they were absolutely not exhaustive. And in fact, in Nepal, a key role, one of the things that we are working on, I'm sure a lot of other people are working on, is to try and support the PTAs, so the parent-teacher associations, to be more inclusive and to allow embrace parents of children with disabilities to be part of those organised groups, because the PTAs often have a big influence within the school sector. So absolutely agree. And the other aspect, as well as the sort of strengthening PTAs, it's also to strengthen, sometimes there's as well as DPOs, I should have highlighted the fact that within that umbrella group, there are sometimes parents groups that kind of fall under that category because they're parents of children with disabilities and they've formed their own organizations. And so absolutely we'll be working with those groups. We're sort of using the umbrella term DPO, but we're also including the parents groups as well. But you're right, the community level work that can go on with parents is key. And in fact, when we were talking about the, I think I showed some pictures of the community march past and those kind of community-based activities. That's one aspect, but the other aspect is working alongside parents to then themselves become more like peer-to-peer supports for other parents, and also to take on the role of going into communities and supporting families of children with disabilities, having also had that training and that capacity building initially. So absolutely, completely agree your point. But I'm glad you raised the point, because then we were able to talk about it since we missed it in the first part. Yeah. Oh.
Thanks a lot for your comments. I have another question from Malekum. How we can ensure inclusive education resources centers usability? In most cases, we see them inactive and closed. I don't know if you want to reply, or maybe I can read another couple of questions and then you make comments.
Could you repeat just one more time? I'm not sure I got the whole thing.
How can we ensure inclusive education resources centers usability? In most cases, we see them inactive and closed. I think that is talking about, or I don't know if Melaku want to take the floor directly. Raising your hands, I will allow you to talk. Yeah, just a second. I will try. Okay, Maleku, you can talk.
Thank you so much. It was really wonderful presentation. Actually, I just sent my questions via the text. I'm not sure if you got them. I'm Malaku from Ethiopia, from the Ethiopian Center for Disability and Development. I'm very glad that I see you both. My question is, on the inclusive education resource centers, most often we see them inactive, once we support them, the schools, providing them with all the necessary equipments. When you go there after some time, you don't see them active. So how can we really keep them, active and more usable for children with disabilities at the school? That is my first question. The other is related with I think it was Siân, you mentioned when you talk about the Nepal experience, you mentioned about disability identity card. We don't have that kind of card, unfortunately, here in Ethiopia. But so how, like, what would be also the role, you know, having that kind of document? Would that help, you know, and facilitate the inclusive education approach? I would love to, you know, hear more in that area. My most important and really something which puzzles me all the time is the question on you know, mainstream schools or inclusive schools which are in rural areas. In most cases, the challenge is getting children with disabilities to the school from, you know, distant areas. Mostly the roads are bumpy, may not be accessible, even if we have the capacity to provide them with assistive devices, wheelchairs. But the most important question is how can we get them, you know, from their home to the school? So I have been really trying to see options or solutions, but if there is any good practice toward that, I would be very happy to learn. And thank you so much, both, for your time. It's really enlightening.
Thank you. Should I take the resource center and then you do the disability?
Okay, yeah. And I'll add something, but you start.
Yeah, of course. I was thinking on the resource centers. Obviously, each country has its own solution, and I can't comment specifically on your situation in Ethiopia. But I would say that working with the DPOs and with other stakeholders, such as parents groups and other teachers groups, that you need to advocate to the government, because it seems to me that if the government is involved in supporting the resource center in the first place, it's about monitoring how that works and supervising how that works. So there needs to be a system in place that isn't just about developing resource centers, but then how those resource centers are going to be financed, how they will function, have a clear understanding of the roles of resource centers. And I've seen some interesting examples in Vietnam, for example, where the government has been quite specific around what roles and responsibilities are for resource centers. I'm not saying it's the only solution, but I think it's possibly one of those solutions, because ultimately it is under the Ministry of Education's responsibility to provide for the education of children, all children, including children with disabilities. I don't know if that helps very much at all, but I do understand. I have also seen in other countries where it is very challenging when investment has been made to resource centers. I know in Papua New Guinea that one of the solutions was that all the staff in the resource center were their salaries and their roles and responsibilities, their contract was under or is under the Ministry of Education, and because that has its own supervisory practice, obviously there is some responsibility from the schools and from the centers themselves to continue the function. I think that's it for me on resource centers. Over to you, Julia.
Okay, I will continue on if that's okay, and then you can come back afterwards. But yeah, on the issue of Ethiopia and resource centres, we actually do have a project in Ethiopia, so I'm not sure. There are obviously different ones across the country, and I do understand the point where you absolutely rightly make, that if, for example, NGOs help to set up resource centres, I know a few that exist there, it's absolutely paramount there's some sort of sustainability plan if they then finish. You know, oftentimes NGOs might have a project for a few years and then ultimately hand over to the government. But if there maybe isn't a sustainability plan, then perhaps that's why some of them would fall into disrepute, or not disrepute, disrepair, not necessarily being used. So that's one reason. But however, if they're working hand in hand as the resource centre has been developed, as Siân mentioned, you know, with the government, then, and the other key thing is the training. The other thing I've seen, I think I even could have been in Ethiopia, where, you know, there was a sustainability plan in it, but there wasn't enough training perhaps for all the teachers to be able to use some of the equipment. I think sometimes people can be really interested in technology, high levels of technology in resource centres. I would recommend sticking to low-tech solutions, especially in terms of sustainability outcomes, you might find you've got a raft of new computers with different software that's available that maybe not everybody is able to use, or it might need a lot more maintenance. Whereas if you had more examples, like you could get many more braille slates and styluses and other types of more low-tech resources that might then be easier to be still being used after the project ends without as much training. So I think it's an aspect of training and ongoing maintenance, and if that's, you know, in the plan, in the sustainability plan. And I think that there's a sort of blessing in disguise, really, or a mixed blessing, let's say, with using overuse of technology if it can't be maintained. That's on the resource centres. In terms of, you mentioned the disability card. Now, all I know is that exists, but I mentioned it just to sort of highlight the holistic approach to inclusive education and all the different aspects of what is needed to allow a child, to enable a child with disability to attend school. And so whilst it's not specifically to do with inclusive education, the provision of those disability cards might then help the families to have that bit of little extra financial means to enable them to support their children. For example, be it the transport that you then highlighted was an issue. So the idea of a disability card enabling more financial resources to be available just helps with those extra things that are needed, which actually links to your third point about the transport. I completely see your point. It is often an issue, and very vast distances to schools. In terms of solutions, there's obviously, if there's some kind of low bus system, it depends on what's available in the area. If there's some kind of transport, any kind of transport that is used in the area, be it collective transport, collective cars, collective buses. In other areas, I don't think it's Ethiopia, but in other areas I've seen even like donkey carts being used. It just obviously depends on what's available and what's possible. I think that was in Kenya that I saw that, where it's literally a donkey and a cart, so that's less of a challenge with fuel costs. So most solutions, aside from the solutions such as bicycles or donkeys, where you don't have the ongoing cost, you would have the fuel cost if you are unable, if the distances are too far. But it's something that very much depends on the context, and the other aspect that we've looked at, it's less to do with the distance, but it's more to do with the protection, the safety angle. And in terms of the guidance angle, there's the system of walking taxi systems that are in place in some countries and some settings. I know that those that exist are where people get together on a rota, and they adults decide who's going to be in charge of the walking taxi, which basically means that an adult or a group of adults will go and collect up different children and support them to go to school as a group, which enables, and the adult in charge would vary. So it's not the same burden every day. That same adult has to walk 2 miles, which obviously is difficult time-wise if they have jobs, etc. So this would enable children who maybe need escorting to school, they may need guidance because of visual impairment or mobility difficulty. So that's a sort of low cost or no cost solution. I think those were your 3 questions. Yeah.
Let me just add to that, though. Well, the other thing I think that is important, and Julia said it in her presentation, it's around advocating with the Ministry of Transport and looking for, again, solutions within the country, I would say.
Yes, exactly that, yeah. So you've got the basic level solution, but at the same time, it really isn't acceptable that there's no transport for people to get to school. So, we shouldn't accept the status quo, and that there has to be a way around that, in terms of provision.
Thank you very much. We have another question in the chat box. I also continue to invite our participants to raise the hand and take directly the floor and talk with our speakers. In the meantime, I have another question from Isabel. She's asked some suggestions on how special schools can work with mainstream school to move towards a more inclusive system. Do you have some example to share from your experience? Thanks a lot, Isabel.
Can I start, Siân?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, I'll go first this time. Give you some thinking time. Yes, because you might not need it. No, I've got a good example of that in terms of the use of itinerant teachers. So I know that in Togo, for example, we have worked with special schools to support the provision of itinerant teachers. Another word for itinerant teacher is a mobile teacher, kind of mobile specialist teacher, you could call it, who has a sort of specialism or higher level of knowledge about a certain sector of teaching. So, for example, teaching people who are deaf, teaching people who are blind, they may have specialist skills in sign language or use of Braille. Those are classic examples, but there are others. For example, specialist skills in working with children with autism. You know, so there's different types of specialisms, and sometimes if we work with special schools who might have this expertise within their school, they might want to help support local nearby mainstream schools to become more inclusive by sharing some of their teachers to also become itinerant teachers, maybe some part of the time, or some of their teachers, you know, transfer to becoming itinerant teachers on a gradual basis. I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but so those teachers with the expertise from that specialist setting would then be placed to sort of go between other mainstream schools in the area to support children who have those specific disabilities in those mainstream schools. So they're sort of supporting the promotion of inclusion in the nearby mainstream schools. And gradually over time, it might be the case that those special schools probably have less children because they, you know, some of those children in those schools can actually be transferred to the mainstream schools in the area, provided they have those that specialism supporting them. And then so it's a gradual process, and at the end point you may find that you have more of a resource center rather than a special school, but it's a gradual process. And we're not saying in the example I'm thinking of, they are not at a stage where the special school has completely closed. However, it's changed its focus, and it has less children in it, and those children that are there have more sort of severe difficulties, and they're sort of changing the way that they function so that it's more with an inclusive lens. So I don't know if that helps. That's one example I can think of. Siân?
Yeah, I think that's one way for sure. I have seen in some of current partners and previous partners, one I'm thinking of in Burkina Faso, which was a school for deaf children and had developed expertise for audiometry, in sign language, communication, and so on. What they did was start by including children without hearing loss, so i.e. hearing children, into the system. And by now, some years down the track, as Julia said, it didn't happen overnight. They still have the expertise in terms of assessing hearing loss. So they have a very, very good audiology and audiometry department still. They still have expertise in sign language, but what they have now is right from preschool level, there is a sort of a bilingual communication approach throughout the whole school. What that means in that particular school is that, for example, it's a few years since I was there, but the last time I was there, right at the preschool level, there was a deaf assistant working with a hearing teacher. So there was sign communication and oral communication going on in the classroom at the same time. Then throughout the school, in each class, there would be a number of deaf children, having been a specialist school for deaf children. Therefore, they had educational interpreters in each of the classrooms. There was specialist provision to provide reinforcement support over and above what was supported in the classroom. For children who are late coming to school, so they may be 7, 8, 9, 10, there are what you call, I've forgotten the name, but there would be special classes for those children taught by either a deaf or hearing teacher, and the children would spend the first 1 year or 2 years in that class in order to build their communication skills, in order to build their language skills, so that they could be included in the mainstream in due course. So the goal is also always to be inclusive education. So that's one example where the special school is completely turned around and has a resource, as Julia said, is a specialized resource, i.e. related to deaf children, to communication, and they are recognized as a school which assists in other schools in other parts of the country to support on hearing audiometry, in terms of audiology, provision of hearing aids, and sign language communication. But in other places, I've seen that the special school, again, gradually may develop, for example, an inclusive or a specialized early years provision, with the focus that they will go into the local community schools after some time, or they will have resources for assessment, for teacher training. Maybe I've seen it also where they will towards what they call accelerated learning programs at a later stage, so that students who've never been to school or dropped out from school and have accelerated learning and then go into mainstream or not, or livelihood. So it varies.
I think,
and in India, many examples of that.
I was going to add to that, Siân, in that I think transitory classes is kind of how you're describing what you were just describing. That I've seen that quite a lot, where they become so it's even in the one I was mentioning, they're not necessarily there for the whole time. So it might be the initial 2 years of education, or the first stage to maybe learn Braille or learn just get used to education, and then gradually transition to the mainstream. So that's another way that and they've called them transitory classes. So, but this is very similar to the approach you were mentioning there, Siân.
Yeah, I think for a lot of children who are blinded, they are temporary. They go for 6 months or a year or so, and then they are fully included in mainstream. So it depends on the disability, and it depends on the situation. But it is a gradual approach.
Yeah.
Hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you very much, you both. I think that, well, it's 5 to 4, unfortunately, yet. So we have time just for a last question. The question is from Florence. So her question is how we can get a video clip of an inclusive classroom to use that to convince the various stakeholders in Nigeria that inclusive education is possible, because some people believe that inclusive education means that children are in a different classroom. And I think that it's really interesting, this this question. In a general way, we can say that Florence is asking for suggestions on awareness building tools, I think, how really to support it.
Okay. Can I just check your question? Did you say bigger clip? I wasn't sure I got you.
I didn't get
yes,
it.
Florence, I think she was really specific, but I think that the meaning is just suggestion on how really building awareness, and some tools to build awareness. Right? Because
resources.
Yeah, exactly. Some resources on how to show that is inclusive education. It's real. It's possible.
Can I start, Siân, or do you want to? Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of the poster, if you were thinking about that one, because that's quite a visual one. Yeah, that was used as part of a report that we did at GCE a few years ago, but it is available. We can put it on the resource list, so that's something you can print out, and that's a useful resource. It's got the copyright on it, I think, and there's a French version, should you need it. So we'll make sure that goes on the pack that Alicia, I think you compile. In terms of other resources, I would suggest ENET has a great resource library. ENET, I don't know if you know it, it's the Enabling Education Network. If you Google ENET, you'll no doubt come across it. It's very useful for resources on inclusive education, and they have a really good library there of the good inclusive education videos. And I think videos is one of the best methods to convince people who are otherwise unconvinced about the benefits of inclusive education. Obviously, there's resources that we can share in terms of those big, reports and documents, but I think you're thinking of short, sharp, easy to watch, easily digestible resources. So yeah, I would go there for the videos. And then also we have I should mention our IDDC website, shouldn't I, Sean? We have some resources on there in terms of more general inclusive education resources. But I think that in terms of the short ones, those would be the best places. And also source. Go to source.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry if I interrupt you. Just because Florence raised their hand, maybe she can explain better, or I made some mistakes in interpreting her question. So I'll try to give you the floor.
And then
okay, you can talk.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks. Yulia, you got what I'm looking for, a video to be able to convince many that inclusive education is possible.
Yeah.
You find out in Nigeria, especially the special teachers, they don't want to hear about inclusive, as if they are very protective of the children. They don't want them to mix up. And as you have all shared, the parents sometimes also, they don't want their children to mix up with children with disabilities, as if they are going to get contaminated or infected, something like that. So that's my listing. The video.
Video, great. Well, we'll send the link.
Yeah.
We'll make sure that's a link. I'll pass you over to.
No, I think then perfectly. If it's a video you're after, you can look at these what they call training videos. There are 10 of them on ENET, which would be, you can choose the one that's perfect for you and your situation. I mean, there are a lot of tools available, but I think we will have a pack together. But I think from what you've said there, Julia, and you've just asked, I think that what you're looking for, you should be able to find in that video clip. There is a very nice also a video on the end of cycle series. I think we should add that to the list. And there's one that was actually filmed on a young woman from Nicaragua, and saw how she was delayed in going to school because there was some concerns around, how would she fit in and so on and so forth. She had a visual impairment, and it's a story of her and how she and how her parents are delighted with how inclusive education has worked for her. So I think I can add that also, that link to that resource.
And I'm thinking if we find one of Nigeria, we could do that. And if we have also, I was thinking I have a good one from Ethiopia. So the gentleman who was asking earlier, we can maybe add that one since it's relevant. It talks about the resource centres and how they can be used. So that might be relevant to you as well. But yeah, we can add some. I agree that's the best way to convince people.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Unfortunately, we arrive at the end of this session. I have still some questions that we don't have time, unfortunately, to answer. But I will take notes, and I invite you to write to our email and just send your questions, and we will give you soon an answer. We will try to give you an answer. So thank you very much, Siân and Julia. This session, as I said, was really interesting. This hour really was super fast.
Yeah.
So I leave you, also the participants and you both. But before, I have just a couple of things to say, especially to our participants. As you know, the webinar issues a certificate of attendance with only to those who will attend at least 75% of the webinars and respond to the satisfaction survey. I know that we had a problem with the satisfaction service last time. I think we fixed it. So the one that we share after this session will work. No worry if you didn't. The past one we'll consider it and we'll take in consideration this technical problem. So you will receive the survey together with the webinar recordings and the learning materials and the follow-up emails at the end of this session. The next session will take place Wednesday, 25 March at 2:30 p.m. Brussels time, and it will be about universal access to employment. I really recommend you to not miss this session also, because also the access to employment is a really important and practical topic to discuss. So take notes on your agendas, also because we have another important international expert. I'm talking about Stefan Trommer from the International Labour Organization. So thanks again to participants, to our speakers today, Julian, Sean, thank you very much. Continue to follow us and our activities on our communication channels. So thanks again. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you for joining.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.